Hey everyone, my name is Olivia and I'm going to be presenting on Chapter 8 of the textbook this week, and it's titled Moral Cognition and Prosocial Responding in Adolescence. So first, I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of background on this subject. So the first thing, Kohlberg's work, which has to do with the theory of moral development, which you see in the top right corner, it deals with moral development, and it kind of shaped research on this topic in the 60s through the 80s. So more research was done in the 70s and 90s on prosocial development, and there continues to be increasing research and theory about positive youth development in current research today. Research on aggression and antisocial behavior and delinquency is quite abundant in research in the past as well as current, where researchers tend to focus on negative aspects of adolescence, which we have kind of seen in the previous week's discussion. The research on moral reasoning is still pretty limited in quantity, but prosocial behavior research has increased in recent years. So an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today is morality development in adolescence. I'll go into some research on both moral cognitions as well as prosocial behavior in adolescence. I'll go over some age-related trends in normative moral development, and then kind of end with a section on volunteering and community service in adolescence. First, we see that moral judgment and prosocial behavior, such as helping, sharing, comforting, is linked with perspective-taking skills in adolescence. So we see in ages 10 to 12, kind of that late childhood to kind of early adolescence, they're aware of the infinite regress, which is a characteristic in dyadic relationships where each person is kind of simultaneously aware of his or her, I should say, and others' subjective abilities. So this is kind of from a third-person perspective. And then in later adolescence, the individual may become aware that in taking another's perspective, the mutuality of the understanding of each other's perspective or point of view can take on different qualitative levels. So these individuals can kind of know each other as acquaintances, as friends, closest friends, best friends, lovers, etc. So I want to emphasize that morality continues to develop in adolescence. It doesn't stop in childhood or take a break and then kind of resume in adulthood. It's continually developing. These advances in perspective-taking skills that I just noted are important in understanding another's perspective, as well as for other-oriented pro-social behavior, so not thinking just about them, as well as a high-level moral reasoning. That motivation to take on another's perspective increases in adolescence, so they're not kind of just thinking about themselves and their own perspectives, as well as advances in social problem-solving skills and interpersonal negotiation skills that are important in adolescence as they continue to take on more of the adult-type maybe decisions or roles that they might not have had in childhood. There's also changes in conceptions of the self from childhood into adolescence. In childhood, the self is defined primarily in terms of non-moral properties, such as bodily properties, material possessions, or kind of typical childlike behavior. In contrast, by late adolescence, the self is defined more in terms of kind of social and psychological aspects of the self, and morality is the major regulator of social interactions that they have, and belief systems become more essential to characterizing that psychological self. There are changes also in the quality of moral reasoning and sympathetic responding linked to altruistic tendencies that we'll discuss later, such as a willingness to help individuals or groups who are not immediately present. There's also advances in cortical functioning. in adolescence. So changes in brain areas relevant to executive functioning and regulation, such as changes in the white matter and gray matter, which we learned about last week, in the frontal, temporal, and parietal lobes, as well as myelination that occurs. The prefrontal cortex continues to change in adolescence. Improvements are made in executive functioning and the coordination of affect and cognition. There are also changes in neurological systems that are involved in regulation of how these adolescent individuals process and respond to social stimuli, which is especially important in peer interactions. So back to Kohlberg's theory of moral development, I put two pictures up here that kind of give a different wording on what the stages and categories are of this moral development model. Moral judgment is defined as how an individual justifies his or her moral decisions. So we see in the end of childhood and kind of moving into adolescence, we see most individuals at stage 2. So they do something more for themselves. It's kind of linked to individualism, kind of getting what you want by reciprocity and exchange. Whereas as adolescents move, kind of as they grow older, they move to stage 3. So they are doing things more interpersonally. They're thinking about others, and as the picture on the left states, they're meeting the expectations of others. They're showing concern for others, and they are good because it's important and is reflected in having good motives. There are some adolescents who kind of reach stage 4 in which they kind of fulfill those duties and uphold the laws because they're laws, but many kind of stay in the 2 to 3 stage area. Moving on to pro-social reasoning. Gilligan in 1982 coined the term kind of care-oriented reasoning. So it's a focus on not turning away from others rather than not treating others unfairly, such as with justice concerns. The pro-social motives tend to stabilize or become more other-oriented, as we previously discussed, and higher level reasoning occurs with age during adolescence. It is shown in the research that females tend to express more types of moral reasoning and attributions regarding motives for pro-social behavior, but there are also individual differences with these studies. So what are some outcomes of higher level moral reasoning? Research shows that adolescent delinquents use a lower stage of moral judgment, kind of more thinking about themselves, and aggressive adolescent boys in particular show or score lower on moral judgment tests. Adolescents who reason at more mature levels tend to be more pro-social and socially competent, and justice-related moral judgment is related to higher levels of social problem-solving skills, which is important as they continue to take on more of those adult-like roles and decisions. So moving into talking about risky behaviors and morality. Interestingly, there are kind of two views in adolescence on drugs and risky behaviors in general. So the use of legal drugs such as nicotine and caffeine and alcohol, as well as premarital sex, are more seen as a personal or prudential choice in adolescence, whereas the use of illegal drugs such as cocaine or heroin are more likely to be viewed as morally wrong. So students who use drugs are likely to view that drug use as more of a personal choice. We can see that moral reasoning is related to some risky behaviors, but only for those who view them as having moral relevance. The bidirectional effects are still unclear, as many of these studies are correlational, so more research should be done in this area. So how does an adolescent become socialized in their moral attitudes and beliefs? their parents can influence them. So research shows that parents who are more hostile and critical kind of interfere with their ability to grow in their moral understanding. Whereas parents who are more effective and child-centered, kind of that authoritative parenting, helps support the adolescent in their moral development through those adolescent years. Peers are often seen maybe to influence the adolescent maybe more than parents, just because they're around them more, they have more parental, or they have more peer contact. And although parents are important, peers do have a pretty big impact on their socialization of moral reasoning. So peers influence this moral reasoning through friendship, through peer group qualities, as well as discussion about moral conflict. So conflict was something that came up a lot in the reading, just that you need to have some conflict so that the adolescent kind of knows what boundaries are, as well as can kind of challenge them to think for themselves more, as well as consider the perspectives of others. There are also cultural influences. There is minimal work on moral reasoning that's done in other countries, as well as mixed findings in relation to Kohlberg's stages of moral development in other countries relative to the United States. Prosocial behavior, some of the normative age trends. So prosocial behavior increases across childhood, and adolescents tend to be higher in prosocial behavior than preschoolers and those aged 7 to 12. There is sort of a regression to the mean, so maybe a 7th grader or a preschooler even is really willing to help out around the house, where maybe in high school they're not going to do that as much. And it's the same for the opposite scenario. There is not really a clear pattern of helping parents in adolescence, as research shows mixed findings. Empathy-related responding, there are increases in sympathy with age. So they're more able to understand kind of that perspective of others, as we discussed. Talking about gender differences, the stereotype that females are more caring and other-oriented is somewhat supported, but maybe not for other studies. So a conclusion is kind of that the sexes may differ in some types of prosocial behavior, but not others. There are individual differences, as always, and females might tend to view themselves as more prosocial and empathetic and sympathetic than their male counterparts. The family can influence prosocial behavior, both that authoritative parenting with modeling and allowing the adolescents to kind of have a moral courage, and siblings may also have an influence, as well as peers. As we know, they're influential throughout this time period. Finally, moving on to volunteering and community service. About 50% of adolescents volunteer or engage in community service. They are extroverted, committed to others, and have a high degree of self-understanding. These characteristics are more solidified in adolescence with identity development. There are also developmental characteristics that can be seen in those who volunteer and do community service. Going back to the identity development, there are 3 components of this identity development that are related to volunteering, such as agency, social relatedness, and moral political awareness. So all in all, volunteering is associated with positive outcomes regardless of whether or not volunteering is required, such as by an organization or engaged in by choice. Parents, peer groups, and religious institutions kind of help to socialize this volunteering for adolescents. And there are many positive things that influence volunteering in the adolescent years. And as always, more research is needed because most is correlational, or the pre-post research designs don't have random assignment. Thanks for watching.